Hello and a warm welcome to Researcher's Desk. Today with us we have Hans Joosten, Professor of Peatland Studies and Paleoecology. Um, Hans is going to be talking with us about the way out of the swamp, um, paludiculture, which I can't even say, wet agriculture. He's as a nature-based solution for drained peatlands. Hans, it's very kind of you to spend time with us at Researcher's Desk this lunchtime. We're very much looking forward to learning from you. I'm going to hand over to you now, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my own camera off so we get a really nice recording. And I will turn it on again if we have any technical difficulties. Um, Hans, a warm welcome to Researcher's Desk. The floor is yours.
Okay, let me see.
I'll just let you share screen for us there. And that looks great. Superb. Hans, over to you.
Yes, I have shortened the title as you might see because Caroline thought it was necessary to explain in the title a little bit on what I'm going to talk about and what I'm going to do. But as you are now here and cannot escape anymore, I will simply explain what I'm doing and where it is all about. Paludiculture, the inevitable solution. So this picture that you all know is going to dominate our future. It expresses that our planet is getting warmer and warmer, and that is associated with decreasing food and water security and growing social breakdown, conflict, and migration. The number of catastrophes, disasters, and their severity are rapidly increasing with enormous losses of lives and money. We talk about millions of lives and trillions of dollars of damage every year already. And this, as we have all unanimously agreed, has to stop. The Paris Agreement is what I think one of the most important achievements of our civilization, where all countries of the world have unanimously decided to stop climate change, in spite of these countries being in war with each other, because they recognize what is coming towards us is more threatening than everything we have known. So Paris has actually made the world a simple place because we have one clear and common goal to keep climate change well below 2 degrees and when possible limited to 1.5 degrees. The Climate Convention has then in 2015 asked the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, IPCC, what that means if we want to restrict climate change to these numbers of 1.5 and 2 degrees. And in 2018, the IPCC has reported what it means with respect to greenhouse gas emissions, that to reach this goal of 1.5 degrees, CO2 has to be net zero in 2050, and it has to be a sink after 2050. With respect to methane, the aims are a little bit smaller, 50%, and nitrous oxide 20%. That has all to do with food security because methane emissions is associated with rice cultivation and ruminants. And nitrous oxide is a collateral effect of fertilization. Since 2018, these figures have been confirmed by further studies of IPCC and other scientists and have even become more urgent. It is clear that every extra ton of greenhouse gases makes the climate warmer, like you get it warmer with every new jacket, more jacket that you pull on. And the question is clearly not when, whether we are going to reach zero, but when. Net zero is uncharted territory. When the Kyoto Protocol was ratified in 2005, we were aiming for a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions of 5.2% only for the industrial states. The developing states were kept free because there was a clear relationship between economic development and greenhouse gas emissions. As I said, these countries still have to develop. Even when we were negotiating the Paris Agreement, I have been myself a negotiator in this process for 7 years, and we were all convinced that a 60 to 80% reduction would do the job. It was only the IPCC report that clearly spelled out that we have to go to net zero. And net zero means that every remaining emission has to be compensated by a permanent sink. And these hardly exist like this picture from the Harz Mountain in Germany expresses. The hope was first on technical solutions, specifically carbon capture and storage, CCS, but their technological and technical development, and specifically the scale they are reaching, are until now disappointed and insufficient to reach the goals. To illustrate that, the two CCS plants in Norway, which are the plants with most experience, have until now withdrawn every year an amount of CO2 from the air that is equal for an entire year to what the peatlands in Lower Saxony, the drain peatlands in Lower Saxony, a federal state of Germany, emit in 6 weeks. So the proportion is absent. And also the nature-based solutions, as I showed in the former sheet, are disappointing. Even the boreal forest is no longer a carbon sink. It has become a source in the last years. So it is clear that we have to reduce emissions immensely to actually to zero. And that means that we have to change our behavior also with respect to peatlands, and that's where I'm talking about today. As you know, natural peatlands that we call mayas are ecosystems in which the production of organic material is larger than their decay, and as a result, dead plants accumulate as a substance we call peat, which largely, for 50%, consists out of carbon. And this peat is conserved by water saturation. Natural peatlands are always wetlands, and in many countries of Europe, specifically in Central Europe, like in Germany and the Netherlands and Denmark, people can hardly imagine how wet a natural peatland has to be. This peat accumulation is a slow process, so the rule of thumb is 1 millimeter per year. But this peat accumulates over thousands of years, and in that way, it has accumulated meters of peat and concentrated carbon in these thick layers of peat. The sink capacity of the global peatlands is not that large. Our latest inventories show that 88% of the peatlands of the world are not drained and are still potential carbon sinks. But this entire sink capacity of the undisturbed peatlands of our world equals only to 1% of the emissions from fossil fuels. So peatlands will not save the world. We have to do that ourselves. The climate importance of peatlands is specifically in their peat carbon stock. Peatland is peatland, is land with peat. And this peat is very easily eroded, is very easily destroyed when it is not protected by water saturation and or by vegetation, as this picture shows of immense erosion in the Wicklow Mountains in Ireland. Peatlands are, because of this very long-lasting carbon accumulation, the most space-effective carbon stores of all terrestrial ecosystems. Is no other ecosystem in the world what per hectare stores more carbon than a peatland. A 15 centimeter thick layer of peat, which is not sufficient for calling something a peatland, may contain per hectare already more carbon than a high carbon stock tropical rainforest on mineral soil like you see illustrated here from Gabon. Peatlands cover merely 3% of the global land area, but in this 3% they contain 600 or even more gigaton of carbon, specifically in their peat, and this is twice the carbon stock of the world's total forest biomass on 31% of the land. So 3% of the land area stores twice as much carbon than the forest on 31% of the land. This illustrates how important peatlands are for carbon storage. Living peatlands, they still abundantly worldwide, 88%, as I have mentioned already. And even, of course, in Sweden, within Europe, Sweden is one of the countries that has conserved a lot of good peatlands. But that is not the issue from a climate point of view. When we talk about peatlands and climate, we talk about cows on drained peatland, we talk about potatoes on green peatlands, we talk about forests on drained peatland, we talk about oil palm on drained peatland, or we talk about pulpwood on drained peatland. Because the issue is that the problems with peatlands are caused by drainage, the removal of most of the water. In this respect, peat is like pickled gherkins. So if you remove the conserving water from the pot, then after a while this organic material vanishes, it disappears, it rots away and changes into CO2. Peatlands are actually to some extent like bombs. As long as you do not lit the fuse, you can quietly sleep on a bomb. But like with bombs, if you lit the fuse, the hell is loose. So if you drain the peatland, really the emissions start immensely. To give you some examples of Central Europe, but they are similar with respect to southern Sweden. 1 hectare of deeply drained grassland on peat emits annually more than driving 140,000 kilometers with a middle class petrol car. The footprint of the products that are produced there are enormous. 1 kilogram of cheese contains 45 kilograms of CO2 because of the vanishing peat layers. 1 liter of milk equals in its emissions value 2 liters of petrol. So if you like to drink a glass of milk with breakfast, you can think I could as well drink a liter of petrol. The same is with arable land. The potato field on peat emits twice times more carbon from the peat than the produced potatoes contain. So peat potatoes are actually fossil resources. You can as well or better eat coal. Oil palm on peat emits 60 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year, meaning that for this amount, every hectare, you can fly 50 times. It's every week except for Christmas from Berlin to Jakarta and back, but only economy class, as you understand. So globally, drained peatlands on 12% of the peatlands are drained, and they represent 0.3% of the total land on Earth. They emit 2.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent, which equals 5% of all global emissions, both and mostly by microbial oxidation and also by peat fires. So you can consider peatlands to be hotspots of emissions. You can also express it, yeah, economically. Drained peatlands and agriculture on drained peatlands actually causes more than 500 billion euros of climate damage worldwide. And nowadays, with the development of attribution science, we can break it down more clearly, even in terms of human suffering. Since 1980, the emissions from drained peatlands have pushed 30 million people outside the human temperature niche, defined as temperatures, mean annual temperatures of larger than 29 degrees. And to break it down, it simply means that every 2,000 tons of carbon dioxide means one human life. Every 60 hectares of arable land on peat, one human life, and every 75 hectare of grassland on peat, one human life. This is not a matter of blaming the farmers who are busy there. It is simply to illustrate the responsibility that we have, the human and moral responsibility to solve this problem together. In 2090, if we do not change our behavior with respect to peatlands, this number will have grown to 185 million, mostly poor people with little choice but to die, to fight, or to flee. And here you see a picture of human niche displacement induced by climate change and demography combined. You see that the countries that are going to suffer most are the tropical countries and the subtropical countries. Not we. We are not suffering that much, but these are the poor countries which have little capacity to protect themselves from climate change by air conditioning or good housing, etc., etc. So they will suffer most and they will spread around the world. So this issue of emissions, climate change, migration and war are strongly interconnected. We have to be aware of that. Paris the Paris Agreement implies we must until 2050 re-wet all drained peatland, which means 2 million hectares per year worldwide. In the European Union, this is 500,000 hectares per year. And if I mention this number, people often say this is illusory, this is naive. And we can never do this. But we must be aware if we cannot do that, we can forget largely about the Paris Agreement. We can better be honest and leave the Paris Agreement. And we have examples also from the past that things are possible on a large scale in a short time. Your neighboring country, Finland, for example, drained in the 1970s up to 300,000 hectares of peatlands in 1 year. So we have to think about the narratives, the motivation, the financing, the organization of these large-scale projects had to solve this problem. An example is Indonesia, where in 2015, 2 million hectares of drained peatlands were in fire, which caused over 100,000 people being killed, 500,000 people with lung diseases in the hospital, and something like 40 billion US dollar domestic damage. And at the same time, the haze of these peat fires blocked the economic hubs of Kuala Lumpur and Singapore for months, leading really to big political damages. And as a result, the then president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, had decided he created a task force directly under his responsibility over the ministries with the assignment to re-wet 2 million hectares of drained peatland until 2020. An enormous challenge, and I have scratched behind my ears whether that would be possible because I have been rewetting a lot of peatlands. But my biggest project was rewetting 73,000 hectares of peatlands around Moscow, and this was an enormous enterprise. And 2 million hectares is an enormous amount. But in fact, in the period 2017 to 2023, Indonesia has rewetted 3,800,000 hectares of peatland, meaning almost 20 times as much as entire Europe in its entire history. This rewetting was not all optimal, and that's why I put it between brackets. But it were initiatives taken over such a large area. In contrast, the rewetting in Europe has hitherto focused on the easy stuff, abandoned and low productive land with few emissions, like here the moors of Scotland that Alasdair will recognize. And these have hardly any opportunity cost. They have no economic value really, so they can easily be rewetted, which is very good for biodiversity and other reasons. But for the climate, it doesn't bring so much. We have to go to the core of the problem, and that is intensive agriculture and forestry on drained peatland. And then we actually have only two options if we want to rewet. Either we create new wet wildernesses, so we rewet the hitherto agriculturally used lands and abandon them for productivity. That will be good for biodiversity and for all kinds of other ecosystems. It is not useless. It is not for nothing. The ecosystem services that wet peatlands provide, including evapotranspiration cooling, including flood control, including water purification, including biodiversity, are immense. From a macroeconomic point of view, it is still feasible. But if you need to have produce from these lands, And we should not forget that these peatlands have been drained for agriculture or for forestry to produce biomass. If we need this biomass, we have to implement and develop a kind of wet agriculture, re-wetting while maintaining necessary production. An issue we called paludiculture. That is actually paludiculture, that you produce your biomass under conditions that do not harm the peat body and that minimize greenhouse gas emissions. This picture illustrates the ambassador of Indonesia in Germany, who was visiting us often to look at our paludiculture experiments and pilot projects, because he said that is also the future for Indonesia. We have drained millions of hectares for creating biomass for our 250 million people that we have. And we cannot allow these areas to be re-wetted and abandoned again. We need this biomass. So we have to combine biomass production with wet peatlands, paludiculture. And now the guy has become in the new government of Indonesia, the Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs. So it's very interesting that on this level, a person is sitting who is well aware of the problems of drained peatlands and their possible solutions. In Europe, we can combine this rewetting of peatlands also with photovoltaic. There is nothing against that if biodiversity does not prevent that. Then it is a good idea because photovoltaic can be very efficient for creating energy. Paludiculture, the wet agriculture, must focus on markets for which it is intrinsically better positioned than dryland agriculture. Or agriculture is actually a dryland agriculture. It stems from the Middle East. It has expanded over 10,000 years over Europe and other parts of the world, and it has adapted wetlands to dry conditions. That's where the problem is all about. If wet agriculture would be more economic, would bring more profit, then wet agriculture farmers would immediately do that. It is not the case yet. We do not have developed these products yet. But these products have to be developed, and there are very good perspectives for that. And one of these perspectives are the structural properties of wetlands. Because many wetland plants are growing into water, they are exposed to much greater forces than plants that grow into air, because the weight of water is much higher than that of air. So they have to create their structure to cope with these forces. Furthermore, they have to get the oxygen in the root zone, and for that purpose, they have air conducting tissue, the so-called parenchymes, that brings air in the roots. And the combination of these things leads to very strong, light, and open structures, which make these plants very suitable for climate-friendly construction. It's not for nothing that wetlands plants have been the most important lightweight building materials for many thousands of years all over the world. Here, a woman who is carrying a part of her house with one hand on her head. Example of products where we can think about are, for example, reed for high quality construction material. The demand for such building materials will increase immensely because also the building sector has to become carbon neutral in the framework of our climate aims. And currently, building is based on concrete, on glass, on steel, all kinds of products that require enormous amounts of CO2 emitting energy. And we can partly replace them by renewables like reed, or another example, cattle. Cattle is also such a substance which is very well suitable for construction, for insulation, for growing media, for plastic alternatives, for packaging, etc., etc. When we think about wood, we have to think about alder, but maybe also other species like spruce in Scandinavia under wet conditions. We can use the undifferentiated biomass for burning, like we have shown in a heating plant in Malchin in our federal state that is already running for 15 years purely on biomass that has been harvested from wet and re-wetted peatlands. We are cultivating peat moss in paludiculture as an alternative for peat as a resource for growing media in horticulture. Peat is on a very large scale used in horticulture, also in commercial horticulture. All the vegetables and ornamental plants that we are and fruits that we are consuming are cultivated in one part of their life cycle on fossil peat, and this has to be replaced by renewable alternatives. And one of the best examples of that, high quality examples, is sphagnum biomass, which we are at the moment cultivate on a large scale in Germany already as a pilot. We talk about hundreds of hectares at the moment already. And we can use this biomass material when we use it for construction material also as a long-term storage of carbon. For example, this tiny house that you show here, that we show here, except for the refrigerator and the people that you see here, everything is made out of Paludi biomass, out of cattail, phalaris, reed, and alder. The second interesting part of wetland and peatland plants are their plant ingredients. Because they have to make strong constructions, a lot of wetland plants take up silicium to strengthen their tissues. That makes sedges and cladium, for example, very sharp. You can cut your fingers open with that because there is silicium in it. The silicium cannot be taken up very selectively, and all kinds of other elements, specifically germanium and rare earths. So the stuff where currently wars are about for our digital industry are accumulating with the wetland plants in their tissue. So they can be an important part of the recycling of these rare elements. And last but not least, wetland plants are, yeah, living in difficult circumstances. If you are always living in wet conditions, you are attacked by bacteria and fungi, etc., also as a human being, as you know. And these plants, they produce their bactericides and fungicides themselves with often medicinal effects. The Russians have clearly recognized that, and they have written a book about that, Apteka na Bologna, the pharmacy in the peatland. But two postdocs of mine have started a farm in which they cultivate sundew that until now is harvested from the wild in Finland and in Madagascar, where they cultivate sundew for the pharmaceutical industry, which is very promising. The problem is that most paludiculture production lines need another 10 to 15 years for development for large-scale implementation. We really talk about big areas that have to be changed in agricultural production. Some of these products can immediately be brought on the market, like reed and sundew, fodder fuel, and peat mosses, but a lot of other things like cattail need further development of the production lines. But a lot is happening. There are industries in Germany who have taken the initiative. They have made a study that if you would replace 1% of the paper feed in Germany by biomass coming from paludiculture, you could re-wet 100,000 hectares of agricultural peatland. And since last year, the biggest post-order company of Germany, so the Amazon of Germany, Otto dispatches its merchandise in Paludi boxes, and it has recently committed to maximize the production of Paludi biomass in its packaging material by 2027. So peatland can do more, it is written on these boxes. And also other companies are working in this direction. In April 2024, there was a treaty signed by 14 of the largest German companies that commit to create demand for Paludi biomass by building this Paludi biomass in their production chains. These are, that is the so-called Paludi Alliance, that involves big, also international companies that say, okay, we are so big, we can really develop and test the use of this Paludi biomass in our enterprises, even when we do not earn any money with it for the coming 10 years. But we can, on one side, secure new resources in a world where resources are becoming rare. and we can, yeah, present ourselves also with respect to social corporate responsibility. And yeah, we have in the European Union now also this corporate social responsibility directive. You have to report on it. You can make your climate footprint smaller by using this kind of stuff. So it is also attractive for these companies. Because that is not running fast enough. We also have to find an interim solution, and that can be found in carbon credits because every more institutions adopt so-called net zero targets, but cannot achieve them on their own. The development of technology is not that far, but they can reach it by, yeah, buying offsets, things to compensate their emissions by emission reductions from other institutions and enterprises that are bought by them. So, for example, Heathrow Airport has uses peatland rewetting in the UK to compensate for emissions to reach carbon neutrality. And on a European Union level, there is a lot of work being done at the moment in the so-called carbon removal, carbon farming regulation. The European Union wants to have in 2026 EU-wide a system in operation where farmers can earn money by increasing their humus content in mineral soil, by reducing emissions from peatlands, by rewetting, by planting trees. This CRCF framework, the delegated acts are currently under production, and they will be decided on next year. So this is another aspect of, yeah, this carbon trading that is responsible. That is also so interesting because the prices of carbon have increased very much in the last 10 years. You see, they were around €5 in 2016, and currently today they are on €81 per ton. If you consider that rewetting of peatlands can reduce emissions with 20 to 30 tons per hectare per year. And if these prices could also be gained with emission reductions from peatland rewetting, we talk about a considerable source of income for farmers as an alternative for their current business. And we are sure that the prices of carbon will increase because the damage costs of carbon are also very huge. Here, the latest estimates of the Environmental Agency, the German Federal Environmental Agency, that estimates that these prices are going to be in the hundreds of euros per ton. Carbon trading provides time for paludiculture to be developed and established, and that's a good thing. And how can we implement that? We have to best to guarantee an attractive price for carbon credits and for generating carbon credits. And then the farmer can decide either to continue drainage-based agriculture as before, or rewet with or without paludiculture at a preferred point in time. That has as a big advantage, and we still have some decades to go, that you can interfere with with product cycles, with enterprise cycles, and with human cycles. If you have to invest in your company very much, you can also change your company. If you have a successor, a new generation of farmers coming in your company, and that's the time to change things. And you have to use these windows of opportunity to make these big changes. In 2050, all peatland must then be wet, or the farmers that want to contain on a drainage base, they have to buy very expensive credits for compensation. This leads to a system that in the medium term leads to a protection of trust. You cannot blame the farmers that they are on drained peatland. They have done a lot in the past to make these farms operational with a lot of sweat and tears, etc. They are not to blame, but we have to change these things. And in the long term, you have to go to a system where the polluter pays. That would be a fair balance of interest. Good. The last question that is always asked, what about methane after re-wetting? Because everybody knows that when you re-wet a peatland again, then the generation and emission of methane may start again or will start again. If you have this choice between methane from re-wetted peatlands and carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide from drained peatlands, you always have to go for the methane. That has to do with the fact that methane is a strong but a short-lasting greenhouse gas with a residence time in the atmosphere of average of 11.7 years, whereas CO2 is a weak greenhouse gas, but it accumulates. It stays in the atmosphere for hundreds and thousands of years. On the longer term, CO2 is always worse. That is explained here in this simple graph. The gray line is the business as usual, where you see that the radiative forcing, so the energy that is changed into heat on the Earth's surface, continues as a result of ongoing CO2 emissions. The yellow line is that you on one point here in 2000 re-wet the area, and you first get the methane effect of these higher global warming potentials. But because methane disappears from the atmosphere, it becomes a steady state that after some decades, the same amount of methane disappears from the atmosphere as is entering the atmosphere. And then this carbon dioxide reduction effect is going to win it. And you see these lines crossing in this graph in 2030. And even if you have an initial enormous methane peak, what we sometimes have when we, for example, re-wet lush meadow grass and do not remove the grass, you get a peak of methane. Even then, at the break-even point with the business as usual is foreseeable within the near future. So that's why we have to re-wet these peatlands. We have a Dutch expression, I'm Dutch from origin, that is zachte heelmeesters maken stinkende wonden, soft doctors make stinky wounds. We have to do, we have to act now and as soon as possible. And if we do not do that, to take these painful operations, then we will suffer later much more. We need to take rapid and drastic action and explore new avenues, but we have also to use the time available. I'm a little bit against that climate targets are over exaggerated, that you want to realize these things immediately, because that is not possible to change a land use so substantially as is needed. It will take time. We must set out on the journey. We know the direction. We do not know everything, but we will find the right path on the way by following the pioneers, combining established knowledge with new technologies, learning by doing, and being persistent, consistent, and transparent. And in general, we know the perspectives for peatlands as they have been formulated by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations already in 2012. Keep wet peatlands wet, make drained peatlands wet again, and if you need to use them wet. Peatlands must be wet for the climate, for the people, for the peatland forever. There will be no Paris without peatlands, paludiculture for future. That's it. Thank you.
And thank you so much for a dynamic and extremely pedagogic talk.